Good evening and welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. I'm Carolyn Bubert, President. Tonight's topic is housing, and specifically solutions to our affordable housing crisis. This is particularly timely given that the legislature just approved a priority housing package of bills totaling $376 million to help solve our state's housing crisis. This program will focus on what is being done to solve our housing affordability gaps, including developing new units, preserving existing affordable housing, homeownership, and expanding rental assistance. The League of Women Voters is dedicated to making democracy work. One of our core beliefs is that democracy functions best when voters are informed and engaged. That's why we put on programs like this. After tonight, please tell your friends and family that they can watch this presentation on YouTube, which will be on after March 15th, or listen to it on podcast. And the links to those recordings will be on our website, which is www.lwbpdx.org. Our moderator tonight is Ann Davidson. Ann serves on our board. She's the secretary, and she's also in our Housing Interest Group. Anna will introduce the panelists. Ann, I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Carolyn. We're excited to present this program to you with leaders who are making a difference in solving Oregon's housing crisis. We've been hearing a great deal about housing in the media and on social media and on the news, and we are pleased to hear that positive progress is being made from involved leaders. Thank you to our panelists who have agreed to be here tonight. Unfortunately, we had one additional panelist who became ill and was not able to be here tonight. So our first panelist is Mark Gamba. Mark represents Milwaukee, Oak Grove, Northern Clackamas County, and the Selwood, Eastmoreland, and Woodstock neighborhoods in the Oregon State House of Representatives. Wow, amazing. He also served as the mayor of Milwaukee. Representative Gamba is currently vice chair of the Housing and Homeless Committee in the legislature. He advocates for actionable solutions and investments in affordable housing and housing for the unhoused. So, Representative Gamba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ann. Thank you all for having me tonight. It's a real honor. I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about the last session. I may touch on the previous session a little bit just because both of the last two sessions have been pretty heavily focused on the housing issue. And so there's been a number of big bills and concepts that we've been working through. In this session, we passed 1537 and then Budget Companion, which was 1530, and they do a number of things. For starters, they sort of finished the work that had begun in the big housing bill from the last session. And a lot of that work was focused around a cross between helping cities and forcing cities to be more effective at getting more of the necessary kinds of housing built. And there's a variety of ways that they do that. Another part to those bills is that there's a significant amount of money in keeping certain shelters functioning. There's a lot of money in rent assistance, which to my mind is one of the most valuable things that we can do right now, because getting new housing up fast enough is going to take time, and keeping people in their housing is really one of the best things we can do. What we know is that the cost of housing, the cost of rents in particular, are rising far faster than anyone's wages. And I'll touch back on that a little bit later. There was a housing project revolving fund that was created to provide no interest loans to cities for infrastructure, specifically for low income and workforce level housing. That's a key piece because of measures 5 and 50. Cities don't have giant piles of cash sitting around to be able to suddenly add a lot of new infrastructure. So this piece is going to help some cities with specific infrastructure. there was money for home repairs and for climate tools like heat pumps and air conditioners. This is in an effort to be able to keep folks in housing that they currently have that maybe would be hard to stay in without those things, or maybe they might not even be able to hold on to them. 1537 also allowed for fairly easy UGB expansions, urban growth boundary expansions. The thought behind that is that some cities don't have a lot of developable land, that particularly for smaller cities, UGB expansions are technically difficult and require a lot of staff time and typically consultants. So this is an effort to help some of that happen. It was a pretty contentious piece, and there's less of an expansion available than there was in the beginning of the negotiations, but it's not insignificant. There was a bill that put $5 million into IDAs, I always forget what it stands for, individual development accounts, I think. And the idea behind those is sort of to help folks build wealth in the broad sense. It's money that you can put into an account that then the state matches, and you can do things like a down payment on a house, maybe a car, maybe starting a business or something like that. But that's the purpose. The request, and I thought it was a pretty modest request to begin with, was $10 million, and it was cut in half. So it's not nearly enough for the possibilities that it could have covered. House Bill 5201 allocated $30 million to preserve some existing low-income housing because many of the federal projects are hitting their 30-year requirement. I don't know if folks out there understand how most affordable housing is built these days, but it's a tax structure that folks that have investment funds can put into affordable housing, but the affordable housing has a time limit after which the project can be resold or turned around and be rented at market rates. And for years, 30 years was the length of time. Most of them now we're trying to do 60 years or better, but we are seeing a lot of projects hitting their 30-year, which is really problematic because that means folks that currently have affordable housing could be out of it. So there's money that's in that, again, not nearly enough for the need. I know Brian will pick up all the slack of all the things that I forgot to mention. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk about my concerns with where we are and kind of what next steps or some of the next things we might want to think about if folks are okay with that.
Absolutely.
So one of the issues we have is that even though in a lot of cities there is a significant amount of land inside the UGB, very often the people that own that land are trying to hang on to it until the value is even more crazy than it already is. And I think there's a solution to that's going to be a bit of a lift, but it would be something that maybe in the process could help solve our property tax problems. And I might touch on that a little bit later, but it's a concept called land value taxes. And it could be very effective at causing people to go ahead and develop land that they're hanging on to. Another concept that we brought a bill for in the last session was one that would help nonprofit entities that had big pieces of land. So think about churches. Well, there's a lot of churches all over cities that have sometimes pretty decent sized pieces of land, and many of them are very interested in building low-income housing, but they're not developers, and they don't have that. They don't not have the knowledge. They don't have all of the pieces in place. They don't even have money to hire somebody to put the pieces in place. So what this bill would have done is to create a pot of money to help with some pre-development work for a bunch of churches. And that could have, we did a calculation at one point, and we thought that we could have developed about 1,600 new units through the auspices of that work. That bill, unfortunately, did not make it out of Ways and Means in the last session. We will probably bring it back in 25. To my mind, one of the really big bottlenecks is workforce. Right now, pretty much everybody that does construction, that is building housing, is already building housing. There's not a whole bunch of people sitting around waiting for the state to wake up and throw a bunch of money at housing. So when there is a whole lot more money in the market, which there is, both last year and this year, we put more money into building new housing. There's just not the workforce to do it. So what it tends to do is inflate the costs even more. And that's really one of the big pieces that we're going to have to address. I've got a couple concepts. One is more of a slow burn. It's to work with schools and high school students, much like they do in Germany, and help young people who may not be interested in going to college but would love to have a career get the training they need to be able to walk out of high school into a good paying job in construction. The other one is what Singapore does, which is they import a lot of workforce to just build housing. And it's very effective for them. I know immigration is a hot button issue in the States, so it may be a bigger lift here than it might be in other places. But if we want to move faster and get more housing built quickly, that's going to be a piece that we're going to have to solve. We did a little bit in one of the bills on apprenticeships, like creating apprenticeship opportunities. But again, it's going to be not enough. Cost of money right now is very high. So new construction projects are expensive. Construction loans in and of themselves tend to be substantially more expensive than permanent financing. We had a bill, we had a bill last session that would have eventually helped with that. And we had a bill this session as well that helped in a different way. In the 23 session, we had a bill that was the first step in starting a state bank. What a state bank could be doing is during the years when money is expensive and it's hard to finance new construction, the state could step in and finance workforce and low-income housing, be the sort of the main banking entity behind some of that, which would have a couple of knock-on effects. Obviously, it gets more housing built. It also keeps our folks who are doing that work in a job. The last big downturn we had in 2008, we lost a lot of construction workers out of Oregon. And that's part of the reason the cost of construction has been going up about 15% year over year since the end of that recession. So the state bank would have eventually helped with that. The governor chose to veto that bill. We will bring that back in 25. The bill that we had this session that would help with financing is a little bit technical. It deals with system development charges. So almost all cities charge each construction project a certain amount of money to make sure that their systems, the sewer system, the water system, the road system, the park systems, are expanding appropriately to keep up with the growth. And it's not nothing. In some cities, it's actually fairly expensive. What our bill would have done was to allow those SDCs to be paid with the permanent financing loan instead of in the construction loan, which sometimes makes those packages just not pencil out. So I know for a fact, a developer that just finished a project here in Milwaukee was about to start a project down in Eugene, and the financing package was just a little bit too expensive for them to pull the trigger on that. And he told me that had this SDC concept been in place, that would have been just enough to make the financing work. But that bill did not make it out of Ways and Means this session. And I think the really, really big thing that we all have to start thinking about, I mentioned it a little earlier, is that the cost of living, and specifically the cost of housing, is rising far, far faster than anybody's wages. We're seeing rent increases of 8, 10, and 14% year over year. No one gets raises like that. So if they started out renting a place they could afford, 30% of their income, 5 years of those kinds of increases, they can no longer afford that, and they are teetering on the edge of being in trouble financially. And because of that, we have roughly 2,000 working families a month being evicted in the state due to inability to pay. And that has a lot of knock-on effects. The addiction crisis that we're seeing, addiction is a disease of despair. People who are really suffering with all of the issues that come along with becoming homeless are going to often turn to drugs for a little bit of relief. Issues in the classrooms, you see teachers are struggling more than ever with kids that are disruptive, and those very often come from families that are struggling themselves, and so they have a more insecure home. They may not be getting the food they need, things like that. So we will be bringing a bill in 25 that ties the minimum wage to the cost of the average one-bedroom apartment in a given region. It'll take, assuming that passes, which is a long shot, it will take about 8 to 10 years in the Portland metro region, to get from where we are to matching what it costs to pay for a one-bedroom apartment. But once we're there, it should be very effective, for obvious reasons, that if you are working full-time, you should be able to afford a place to live. But secondly, I believe that it will start to cause people with the wealth to invest differently than they are now. I can leave it at that if you have, I haven't been keeping track of time, so.
You're doing fine. If you want to, you don't have to quit right away, but it's up to you.
Well, I'll just mention two other things that are also connected. I mentioned earlier that cities struggle to get sometimes the infrastructure built that they need, and the reasons for that are measures 5 and 50. So I want to back up a little bit. Most states have kind of a three-legged stool of financing, of taxation, of revenue. They have a property tax, they have an income tax, and they have a sales tax. In this state, we've chosen not to have a sales tax. And then in the early 90s, we took the leg that is property tax, and we kind of cut it off halfway down. And so cities, school districts, fire districts, parks districts, counties have all been receiving less and less income relative to the costs of running a city or a school. And so you're seeing more and more of the money for particularly schools come out of the general fund. We are going to have to fix that at some point, because it all connects. All of those issues connect back to housing. So fixing measure 5 and 50 would go a long ways towards solving a lot of the problems we have. And then we have the kicker. We're giving back $5.6 billion to the wealthiest Oregonians this year. That's $5.6 billion we could have put into building housing or paying for the bridge across the Columbia, which is also coming out of the general fund at this point, which means there's less to invest in schools or housing or anything else. We will also be bringing a bill that hopes to fix the kicker in 25. So I will definitely leave it at that point.
Well, thank you very much. A lot of information, a lot of great information. And, we have to thank you for your advocacy, and a lot of food for thought, and a reality check too. So very informative. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm sure there'll be questions at the end as we get farther along. So thank you. And now move on to Brian. I'd like to introduce Brian Hoop, who's the Executive Director of Housing Oregon, which is a statewide association of affordable housing organizations, which gathers 90 member organizations to develop and advance policy, organize a conference and other educational and training events, support several peer groups, and communicate industry news to their members. Prior to this role, Brian was manager of the Community and Neighborhood Involvement Center, CNIC, with the city of Portland. So, Brian, I think that Representative Gambas has set you up, and we look forward to your remarks. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Anne and the League for having me. And I first want to acknowledge and thank Representative Gamba for being so forward-thinking. I vouch for everything he said. He's been a very strong advocate for affordable housing issues in the legislature, and he is putting forward some very creative proposals that many of which our members support and look forward to considering supporting in the next session. Looks like we got a lot to work on together in the 2025 session. So I also want to acknowledge, I think the key thing that's important to me is to acknowledge that, yes, we have many opportunities, new resources that we're very fortunate in the state of Oregon to have at our disposal to tackle the homelessness crisis and to construct more housing units across the state. Also, there's a lot of challenges that our industry is facing, some that the representative alluded to that I was also want to maybe try and cover here so you're aware of kind of some of the new challenges that have kind of arisen more recently after the pandemic, kind of economic challenges created after the pandemic. As far as significant new resources, aside from legislative, yeah, I just want to also put a dollar figure. I think in addition to the $350 million that was approved this short session, I think it was $1.14 billion that was approved in the last session. So record amounts that the state is investing from general funds. I think many of you are also probably aware of the voters in the Portland metro area. A number of years ago passed both a City of Portland construction bond and a Metro construction bond that invested over $1 billion, I think roughly $1 billion or more in housing production. And then the Metro voters had also approved the Metro Supportive Housing Services measure to invest roughly $2 billion. I mean, it was $2 billion in homeless services over the next 10 years. And a few other new opportunities that folks may not be as aware of. Oregon succeeded in securing the federal Medicaid 1115 waiver. It's a new resource that is going to be administered by the Oregon Housing Authority that's going to be providing $1 billion over the next 5 years that can be invested in kind of what we call the wraparound services, you know, to address behavioral health care issues for folks struggling with addiction recovery, mental health issues, you know, and the increased costs that go with kind of that nexus between behavioral health care needs and housing. So maybe I can speak more about that later. Another significant new opportunity that I think a lot of people may not be aware about is there have been several bank mergers affecting Oregon, either very recently or closing, hopefully in the next year or two, that we partner with the National Community Reinvestment Coalition that negotiates community benefit agreements with these banks that they have to secure federal regulatory approvals to close these mergers. And for example, the Umpqua-Columbia Bank merger that closed recently, their community benefits agreement that they agreed with will invest region-wide across their whole footprint roughly about $8 or $9 billion in new investments in low-income communities as part of their obligation to the Community Reinvestment Act passed by Congress back in the 70s. But in Oregon alone, it'll be a commitment to roughly about $3.7 billion, I believe. And that's something I think we need to be more, well, both Dominique and I are on a regional advisory committee with Umpqua Bank. And I think it's one of our goals to expand a coalition of community groups and advocates for low-income communities to be more engaged in tracking that and continuing dialogue with the bank. U.S. Bank bought out Union Bank, BMO, and Bank of the West are also getting close, if they haven't already, to closing a merger. And those are just opportunities of commitments that they will have to make to low-income communities across our state. And then I think a lot of people also don't recognize Oregon Housing and Community Services received a $400 million or in response to the 2020 wildfires, there were several thousand housing units that were lost, mainly down the southern I-5 corridor and the Cascade Range. And just in the last year, the federal government finally promised the $450 million investment, federal disaster recovery resources that will go a long ways towards helping those communities affected by those wildfires begin to produce more units to house folks many who are still living in temporary trailers 3-4 years after those wildfires. So just a few other kind of the challenges and opportunities that we face. I just want to remind folks that the challenge that many states and communities across the country are facing is the response to like the growing homelessness crisis and affordable housing crisis is increasingly being put on local jurisdictions and state governments to try and solve. And I think we have to continually remind ourselves that the federal government should also play a leading role in helping be a partner in solving these issues. And I think most folks need to recognize that there's been a historical federal divestment in affordable housing and homeless services since the Reagan administration, that we just have not kept up with like the percentage of the federal budget that used to be invested in housing up until that time. And it's just been we haven't been able to catch up since the 1980s. And I want to acknowledge, though, that the federal tax package that was just approved in Congress does include some significant new investments in the Housing and Urban Development HUD for affordable housing and homeless services. And the Biden administration's proposal for the next year's budget looks very promising, but of course, it'll probably be very challenging to get his proposed new investments through Congress. Some of the key issues that our industry is facing, and the representative alluded to them, is increasing operating expenses. So post-pandemic, our members have been facing operating increases, including insurance rate increases, mortgage interest rate increases for permanent mortgages for their construction projects, labor costs, supply chain issues, etc. That the costs just aren't keeping up with the revenue sources, especially rents, for example, in regulated affordable housing are regulated, and for good reasons. They're kept at a manageable rate increase, but the costs are going up faster than many of my member organizations can keep up with, and that's creating challenges. One of the things that we'll be advocating in the next 2025 session is I think we're going to be proposing a $50 million flexible housing provider stabilization fund and recognition. What I'm hearing clearly from my member organizations is they just need more flexibility in how they can invest public resources to meet unique challenges each of them have with trying to navigate increasing costs. In the affordable housing industry, it's really complex. Many projects might have half a dozen or a dozen different sources of resources to put a project together, and they're all have very regulated, tightly controlled expectations and rules that they have to follow. And many, state resources, public resources are very well regulated. And I think what we're going to be asking for is, some resources that provide a little bit more flexibility so that the housing providers, have the ability to pivot, find creative solution to address these issues around increasing costs. Another key thing also is since the challenges of the pandemic, many of our member organizations are struggling with the effects of like the increasing chronic homelessness, increasing mental health, addiction recovery issues. And it's taking a toll on kind of the physical structure of many of our members' organizations. I think those in the Portland area, Willamette Week has done a number of stories about growing tensions between renters and affordable housing units, and it's a significant challenge that there's increasing damage to facilities, and that costs money trying to make those repairs. So that's kind of one of the issues that our members are interested in. Also, we're going to be recommending a $50 million flexible pre-development revolving loan fund. So the state of Oregon Housing Community Services, getting ready to implement a significant restructuring of how they bring new projects into the pipeline to get public funding. Historically, it's been a very kind of competitive process. We have this bucket of money, we open up the doors, everyone, organizations can compete for a limited amount of funding. And what they're proposing, and will probably be approved by the Housing Stability Council this spring, is more of kind of like a pipeline project that organizations can bring proposals forward, and OHCS staff will work much more closely in trying to help piece together what the many different funding sources, what might work best for that project, but also try and provide more technical assistance to help housing developers kind of navigate the process of getting approval for public resources. And one of the challenges that we're really attentive to is many culturally specific and many of the smaller rural-based community organizations might tend to have, our smaller organizations may not have the same level of staffing capacity to be able to quickly put together proposals and have liquid cash to be able to purchase properties, hold them over several years while they're putting their proposals together. So we're very fortunate. In the last 2023 session, the legislature approved roughly about $9.7 million for pre-development loans, and we see the need is much higher to help nonprofit, primarily culturally specific and rural-based organizations. They need additional resources to be able to effectively compete against larger for-profit and larger nonprofit organizations in kind of competing that process to get those resources and successfully get those resources. I also maybe wanted to talk about some of the other challenges that developers face. One of the big ones right now at the federal level, Congress is considering the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, and it's kind of wonky, but believe it or not, the House and the Congress approved it, and now we're waiting for the Senate to approve. And what it does, it addresses what the representative referred to as low-income housing tax credits. Call them 4% low-income housing tax credits. And they're kind of generally called private activity bonds, and they're a really important tool to leverage or kind of put in a package with many of the state resources from the general fund or other state resources for housing. And what's happened in the past several years, because there have been such new significant resources in housing in Oregon, those federal tax credits are less available now. They've been used up, and right now the state of Oregon, or Oregon Housing Community Services, is planning on basically for the next year and a half or two, there won't be any of those federal tax credits available, those 4% credits to leverage or combine with state resources, and that's really going to kind of limit the impact of all these new resources the state has come up with now. We don't have that federal tool now, and so this federal resources that can leverage and go hand in hand with the state resources. So this proposed Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, what it would do is it would significantly expand the number of tax credits that would be available for affordable housing developers to, it's called the 50% test. I won't try and explain what it means, but we're now waiting for the Senate to approve it. And if they do, it would be, they estimate it would allow like something like 300 to 500,000 additional housing units to be built over the next several years if it were to pass. So we're very fortunate that we worked this last year. We secured the entire Oregon congressional delegation has been in support of this. Especially want to thank Senator Wyden. He's been the key the key driver for this bill. So thank you to Senator Wyden. Let's see, one of the other two key things that are really important are preservation. Representative responded to this or mentioned this, that we're at risk of losing quite a few units that that are expiring in their kind of regulatory lifeline, and while there have been some limited investments from the legislature, the Oregon Housing Community Services had produced this last year, the Affordable Housing Preservation Strategy Framework, that says what we really need is like a $200 million investment per biennium to successfully catch up with making sure we preserve all the units that exist out there that we risk losing. And many folks, lower income folks, might be might lose those units. So that's something we really want to try and address more. Also, homeownership. I'll let Dominique speak to homeownership issues more. I want to call attention to folks, the Joint Advisory Task Force on Addressing Racial Disparities in Homeownership, I believe was led by Senator Manning, and I'm forgetting the co-chair of that committee. They did some really great work the past few years, trying to call attention to the disparity in homeownership rates between white households and households of color, especially Black and Native American households. But that task force had a number of recommendations that we and other organizations were trying to advocate getting through the legislature, and many of them haven't gotten through yet. So that's something we'll be continuing to try and help advocate for. Another thing that Housing Oregon has been leading for a number of years with the Oregon Center for Public Policy is mortgage interest deduction reform. And I think it's important for folks to realize one of the biggest tax subsidies that the state of Oregon provides, I think it's roughly $2 billion per biennium, is providing mortgage interest deduction for primarily white homeowners, many who have second homes, many who have vacation homes, and it's a loss of $2 billion that we feel that part of that those public resources could be going to help close the homeownership gap or the racial disparity in homeownership rates. And the proposal we've been advocating for quite a few years would essentially shift or start phasing out the mortgage interest deduction for households earning over $200,000 to $250,000 per year. And that would raise roughly $200 million per biennium that we call for, the most significant portion of that would go towards investment in down payment assistance and other homeownership needs to help close that racial disparity gaps in the homeownership rate. And I also want to call attention to some creative thinking up in Washington, the Black Homeownership Initiative, and maybe Dominique was going to speak more to that. But it's a use of special purpose tax credits to target investments and mortgage tools to expand access to homeownership for Black households. And I think what's really important there is, recognizing, providing more access to homeownership for households of color is really a tool to expand generational wealth building, beyond the current house or folks who are in that household. But what are wealth opportunities you can pass on to your future generations? Lastly, I just want to call attention to homeless issues, housing stability issues. Again, looking at the federal government, it really comes down to we need more federal vouchers. Vouchers are one of the key tools the federal government provides through housing authorities across the state that can, provide consistent, long-term, sustained rental assistance for low-income households, many who are 30% area median income and below. Since the pandemic, a lot of resources were invested in emergency rental assistance. I think we need to recognize that many affordable housing providers are still struggling with eviction issues, as the representative referred to. There's still many households that are unable to pay the rent, even these lower regulated rents. And so there's still a need for more emergency rental assistance. I want to call attention to Project Turnkey that the legislature has invested in, that Oregon Community Foundation took a leading role in providing or distributing those funds. It's been an amazing resource to allow developers to purchase older motels and hotels that, those hotel units can very easily be kind of renovated into transitional housing, temporary housing for chronically homeless individuals. It would be great if we continue to invest in that as a tool to address the homelessness crisis. I could probably go on. Maybe is it my time to stop as well? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, probably is time, but gosh, we really appreciate all of your insights and all the latest up-to-date information that you're providing, including the accomplishments and of course the challenges that you and your member organizations face. A lot of information, a lot of very good information, and I appreciate it. I know we'll have more questions as we get to that section of the program. So thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. And we're going to move on to Dominic. Dominic Merriweather is the Executive Director of Proud Ground, which is the largest community land trust in the Pacific Northwest with more than 300 permanently affordable homes in their portfolio. Dom brings years of experience in real estate, most recently as Chief Financial Officer at Innovative Housing, Inc. Proud Ground has prioritized land ownership for lasting affordability, specifically for people of color. It brings permanently affordable housing opportunities to first-time homeowners. So, Dominic, please go ahead with your remarks.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this forum tonight. And I wanted to quickly just say thanks to Representative Gamba. We went down on Housing Advocacy Day, and I was able to meet with his office. I believe he was in committee meeting, which is great. But we met in his office, and it was great as we were going through our agenda to hear representatives in favor of that, the representatives in favor of that. So I appreciate all your work in helping solve some of our housing issues throughout the state and your support in the most recent bills that were passed. It feels like Brian and I are seeing each other almost once a week now, and I appreciate his leadership with Housing Oregon and everything that the association does for housing in our state, and specifically the interest that is gaining in home ownership. And that's the reason that I'm here tonight, is to talk about home ownership as a part of the continuum of housing. I think oftentimes when we talk about housing, the focus is on folks that are transitioning from, living with family or living in a car or in some type of transitional housing. And then we move to sort of the rental, different levels of rental housing from an affordability perspective. And then there's permanent affordability home ownership opportunities that oftentimes gets missed as we're talking about the continuum, but it's a very important element of the continuum, in that I think most of us would agree that we aren't able to always build ourselves out of some of these solutions or situations. And so part of the solution is to also allow folks and to assist folks in matriculating through to where they are in ownership situations. And with the rental rates that we're facing in our community now, it's often that we find that the home buyers that we're helping get into ownership situations, that their mortgage payments are less than what their rent payments are, even in regulated rental properties. And so I think if we consider the opportunities from that framework, we'll see how ownership is a viable option, and it's part of the solution to resolving and making a dent in some of the homelessness and housing issues that we see throughout our community. As we allow folks to level up, if you will, we create more vacancy in the rental pool, and the wait lists are large enough to where we could backfill, vacancy with folks that are on wait list, or folks that are folks that have more barriers. If we decrease barriers, we can actually pull them into rental and allow folks that are at the top realm of that affordability framework, 70 to 80% AMI, where there's actually housing opportunities around ownership for those folks in the market. And what I wanted to quickly do, I have some slides prepared. It's really about the history of Proud Ground and the Community Land Trust. I think oftentimes folks may or may not know about it. So I want to just briefly go through some slides. And frankly, I'm a conversationalist, so I like to get away from like the scripted presentation and get into some questions and answers, and hope that we can have a more fruitful conversation that way. But Proud Ground's been around for 25 years now. This year in October, we'll celebrate 25 years of mission work of creating permanently affordable homeownership opportunities. Our current service area is the whole state of Oregon, as well as Southwest Washington and Clark County. Right now we have, in our land trust, we have 496 homes. Actually, the last 3 years have been really good years as far as moving and creating more homeownership opportunities. Over the course of our livelihood, we've assisted 620 families and ownership opportunities. Most times when folks matriculate or sell their homes in our program, they go on to buy market rate properties. So we've helped 620 families. Most times when they sell their homes, they move into market-based home ownership, traditional market home ownership. We've never lost a home to foreclosure. We've only had 2 at risk in our portfolio in our history. What we did at that time is we bought the homes back and then resold them to another qualified buyer. So we've never lost a home in 25 years of providing homeownership opportunities. And I would venture that there is no other bank in our state that could say that they've ever not received a home back from foreclosure. So our track record is very strong. The Community Land Trust actually started as a result of racial practices in Georgia. And at that time, if you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. And so there were a few Black individuals and residents in that community where they pulled their resources together and bought home and put it into a trust so that their voices could be held at the voting booths. So this was really an equity play way back in the early 1900s to bring folks' voices to the voting booths. And I think that's one of the things when we talk about equity and how do we address situations from the past, I think Community Land Trust is very deeply rooted in the civil rights movement and bringing people's voices to the table and how their communities respond to their needs. So from a Community Land Trust perspective, our organization is run in part by our homeowners. Our board has to have at least 1/3 of its members, of our board members, as homeowners. We also have right now 68% of our board members are people of color. And I think it's important as we try to respond to redlining, gentrification, and other true practices in our communities, that it's important that we have representation at the table, not only of those who've been historically left out of homeownership opportunities for one reason or another, but also to have the voices of our current homeowners at the table as we're making decisions about what our land trust is and what it should be. It was mentioned earlier that about the wildfires in Jackson County and Medford specifically. We currently have a large project going on in Medford, which specifically addresses the housing ownership opportunities for fire-affected families and individuals. So I think from a mission perspective, we first look to create as much affordable homeownership opportunities as we can. And then from there, we look for folks who've been left out of homeownership opportunities historically. And then from there, we look to other causes in our community that we could address through a land trust model to make sure that those folks could have the opportunity to purchase homes at an affordable level. Just today, I spoke with an organization that's actually trying to create homeownership opportunities for survivors of domestic violence. And if you understand how those situations work when you're a victim, you often know that the power is held in the hands of the men that are perpetuating this violence on women. And so the housing model actually provides a cloud for their safety, while also providing them the ability to leverage into financial freedom that they may not have had in their past situations. And so I think it's important that we really could be a tool to address a variety of ailments that face our community. We do also have a project going on in Milwaukee. We hope to close on that later this month or later this spring. It's a cluster home project. There'll be 26 homes in that project that'll come into permanent home ownership at an affordable rate. And so I think from a geographic perspective, we try to reach as many parts of the state as we can. One of our challenges is how do we continue to serve the home buyers once they become homeowners. A true component of Community Land Trust is our stewardship program. And with our stewardship program, what we do is we offer trainings and connections to local resources to help and assist to assist our homeowners. During the pandemic, some of that was help with their mortgage assistance through ARPA funds, but also it could be as practical as you're orientating yourself into your new home. How do you turn off the water at the street? You know, how do you control your gas furnace? Where are your electrical power boxes? What are they used for? These are folks you have to remember who are first-time home owners and sometimes first-generational homeowners as well. And so the things that we might take for granted as knowledge around how to navigate through our homes, sometimes those are foreign to them. And also, most times these folks are coming from situations where they've rented and their first inclination is to call the landlord. Well, now they're the landlord and they have to figure out ways, and we assist them in figuring out ways to take care of the home that they now own. Let's see here. So our funding, so some of the benefits that come through the Community Land Trust, let's talk about that first, is we're making an investment in a specific home and not individual families, which allows our investment to impact multiple families over time and for that investment to grow over time. Just recently, we resold a home that's been in our portfolio since the early 1990s, and well, actually early 2000s, and the home is more than doubled in price, but the price to the next buyer is still at an affordable level. And so when you think about how we invest in communities and how we can impact multiple families and multiple generations, that's one of the situations where it's evident of the benefit of a community land trust. In addition, we are able to have homes placed in gentrifying high opportunity neighborhoods. And what this does is it actually creates affordability and income diversity throughout that community. And we know that our communities are more rich with the more diversity that we have. And so even in some of our more well-to-do neighborhoods in Northeast Portland now, they weren't always that way back when I was a kid in Northeast Portland, we still have homes that are affordable at AMI levels and price levels that folks along that spectrum can afford. And they're right next to homes that are worth, you know, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, and our home buyers are able to get those at $270,000 to $300,000 because we've been able to maintain that affordability. And also we've stewarded the land and helped them to steward the home to where it's still a community asset. And so when you walk down the street, you don't know the difference between a Proud Graham Community Land Trust home and their neighbors unless you go to the county and pull up the records on the home and see what's happened there with the transactions. We love our model because it helps us to serve more individuals and more households. Again, in 25 years, we've helped over 620 individuals or individual households, and we've been able to put almost 500 homes into our portfolio. I think we're going to end this year with around 560 to 570 homes in our portfolio, and that would be a tremendous record-setting year for us. But that's the path that we're on right now, and it's a great time to be the leader of an organization such as ours. And also, the other benefit is that once the subsidy is in the home, there's no additional subsidy that often goes into the home. And so when we talk about stewarding tax dollars and making the best long-term use for those, if we invested, you know, $100,000 into a home to create that first buying opportunity, 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, there's no additional investment that goes into that home from the taxpayer's perspective. And so the community benefit, the return on investment as a taxpayer is unheard of. It's remarkable when you think about a community land trust. So our model is very flexible. You can actually, as a home buyer, you can actually go into the market, into the real market, and find a home of your choosing. And between, especially for folks who are be able to participate in Northeast Portland preference policy, between your down payment assistance, your IDA accounts that you may have, and other sources that Proud Graham can bring to the table, if we can pull the land into the land trust, the home purchase price actually could help you qualify or help you be mortgage qualified for that home, especially when you consider the layering of your other sources of down payment assistance. I think oftentimes people don't understand that our home buyers actually have choice. We don't build 20-row homes and say, here you go in this neighborhood on this street. We actually have a program to where folks can go and choose the neighborhood of their choosing. One of the things that's important to us is that we don't further displace folks. And so when we think about opportunities for ownership, we try to create those in neighborhoods where we know that folks already exist so that their kids are not changing schools. They may not have to change their employment if necessary, that their quality of life still remains the same as much as we can possibly keep it that way for them. And again, if it's what they choose to do. There are ample opportunities for down payment assistance. I think that's one of the things that I appreciate the most about being in this work today is that from a down payment assistance perspective, there are lots of opportunities for folks to participate in our program and other programs similar to ours. The challenge still remains the price of housing and the availability of land to develop for housing, as was alluded to earlier. We're very interested in land banking. I'll be grateful to see that legislation come back onto the table, and hopefully it will pass this next round. I know oftentimes there's an education process that happens with our representatives and folks who are bringing bills before, and so hopefully we've done that with the last in 2023, and so the next round we can actually get something like that approved. It would benefit us greatly. As a small nonprofit, we have 11 staff. We don't develop ourselves. We work with development partners. But if we could develop ourselves, we could actually grow and provide housing opportunities for ownership in a much more rapid and planned runway, so that we can say 40 homes this year and 45 homes this year and start to plan out into the future of how we can create these opportunities for folks. So land banking is one of the things that's really high on our list of things that we'd like to see get done from an advocacy and legislative perspective. Also, if you renovate homes, we provide our homeowners with the ability to recoup some of their costs if they were to improve their homes. So we have a sheet of, for instance, a bathroom remodel, they get more than if air conditioning remodels is a big right now. So folks who are investing in solar, folks who are investing in putting heating and air conditioning systems to their homes, they're getting a higher credit if they were to resell than if they were doing a bathroom or bedroom remodel. Just because we know that those are things that help to keep value in homes, and those are things that make them attractive to the next buyer. And so we can recompensate our home buyers for those types of things. And the other thing I think is new and we're working through, is somewhat of a challenge, but we don't actually have to own the land for it to be in the land trust. We work with, for instance, we work with Habitat for Humanity. They're one of our close partners, and some of their homes have to stay within an HOA or a condo structure. We can still steward those homes for Habitat. They don't have to come into our portfolio for them to be a part of a community land trust and for us to maintain the permanent affordability. And that's where our stewardship really comes into, so that Habitat can move on to their next development. And so we create an HOA to facilitate us stewarding the property through the HOA so that Habitat can move into that. So really, in a partnership perspective, we're working together to try to create as many home ownership opportunities as possible. And then the last thing I want to talk about quickly is just our funding options. There are funding options that are made available through local jurisdictions. Portland had an affordable land acquisition fund that we were able to utilize for a project in the Concordia neighborhood. I know that Tigard has had some local funding available for us. We also get funding at times from different counties. The state has been a great partner. There's a LIFT program from home ownership. A little disappointed that we did not get the home ownership funding that we wanted with this go around. But what we have found is that OHCS and other agencies within the state are working really closely with us to understand the home ownership model more. And also they've been creative and how they've allowed us to expand the program using state-backed funding for homeownership. There's federal funding that often comes into play. I agree with Brian and with others that it is the responsibility of our federal government as well to assist in homeownership opportunities. I think especially as we talk about the racial equity lens that we like to try to use in most all decisions that we make, and our federal government honestly should be using a similar lens. Often what we know is historically, minority folks were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to buy houses. My prior experience working in commercial lending, I've seen the bank policies that forbid ownership of land and housing, and forbidding women and minorities for owning and from receiving lending funds. So I know this was a real thing. I think history tells us that we can't necessarily make up for all the things that have happened in the past, but I think what we could do is recognize that we have a responsibility as much as we can to create opportunities for people to become whole and to start to build wealth that really was pillaged from them and from their families. And so I appreciate Brian bringing up what's happening in Washington State with the Covenant Homeownership Act and the Black Home Initiative. I think it's something that we should be paying attention as the southern neighbors of Washington. They were the first in the country to create legislation designed to create some equity back to folks who have been redlined out of communities in Seattle, the central district of Seattle, but also what I'm finding out most recently is also in my hometown of Vancouver, Washington, where I reside. After the shipyards in World War II was over and the shipyards closed down, there was a legislative action to actually move Black folks out of Vancouver because they had no need for the labor anymore. And so those families were uprooted from their communities. If they had bought homes there, they were told that they could no longer own those homes, and they were basically, no pun intended, shipped out of our communities. And so there are many examples in Washington State where this has happened. My guess is there are also many examples in the state of Oregon where this has happened. My point is that Washington is leading the nation. And wouldn't it be great if the Northwest, Washington and Oregon, led the nation in figuring out ways to recompensate Black and brown folks for wealth that had been taken from them through the disallowance of home ownership? With that, I think I'll close and open up to questions. And I'm just interested for the conversation. So I thank you so much for this time tonight.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your excitement. It's very forward thinking, and your commitment to Proud Ground and all the things that are going on. And we really appreciate it. I would like to move on now to questions from our audience. I might start with Representative Gambo and some of the comments. We did have one comment from a listener that said that changing the kicker is such a necessity. Thank you for your leadership on that. Really sad to be held back by measures like 5. So we appreciate that. And then another question had to do with, could you clarify your statement about incenting people with wealth to invest differently?
Sure. So what we're learning more and more is that private equity in particular has been buying up housing all over the country, but particularly in hot markets like the Pacific Northwest. And in some instances, actually holding that housing empty just to drive up the cost of housing. Those same private equity firms also have investments in companies with employees. So if the minimum wage bill were to pass, and let me just give you a sense of right now, for you to be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment in the Portland metro region, you need to be making about $30 an hour. That's literally what it costs to be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment, the average, not a nice one, the average 1-bedroom apartment. So let's say the bill goes into effect and 8-10 years from now, the minimum wage in Portland is $30 an hour, you're going to see companies that have a lot of employees, particularly lower paid employees, all of a sudden very interested in investing in housing so that the minimum wage doesn't keep driving up. It finally pits wealth against wealth, right? The big property managers, the market rate property managers against, other businesses. So that's the thinking there.
To continue on with you, Representative, a listener asked, I appreciate Representative Gamba's connecting wages with the ability to rent or own a home, but residential construction is typically low-income work. How can we make sure that folks who build the housing can afford to live there?
I would take a little bit of issue with that construction these days is low-income work, particularly all of the trades, right? Every apartment building, every house, you've got electricians in there, you've got plumbers in there, you've got HVAC people, all of those jobs. These days, electricians are that's a six-figure job. And even a journeyman, I was trying to remember the most recent project I looked at, but a journeyman carpenter, I think they're making in the range of $38 to $45 an hour. If anybody else happens to know the reality on that, but that's significantly better than more than half the population right now. More than half the population is making less than $30 an hour. So it's not low income. It's a middle income job.
Anne, can I comment on this?
Absolutely.
So I'm not an expert on wage ranges for the construction trades. I think a related issue to this comment in the chat that a lot of folks may not be aware of, you may wonder why you see many of regulated affordable housing apartment complexes might only be three or four stories tall. And one of the challenges that we face is that there are rules that say once you go over 4 stories tall, or if you put commercial uses on the ground floor, you have to start paying a prevailing wage. And it really pits our, mission-driven nonprofit organizations. We want to support making sure construction trade folks are earning a living wage. Part of the challenge is that tension with, our state leaders, legislative leaders, governor, they want to stretch public dollars as far as they can. And, how low can we get the subsidy per unit to build as many units as possible? And if we were to pay prevailing wage, higher like union level wages for construction trade folks on many of the regulated affordable housing projects, the challenge is my members say, that can drive up the cost of production 25-30% or so. So there's that tension. It's like, okay, we do want to support higher wages for construction trades, but is the state or is the public willing to invest more, recognizing the cost is already rising significantly? My understanding of voters down in Berkeley supposedly passed a measure that, the voters said, yes, we are willing to tax or invest in making sure that all regulated affordable housing is, built with prevailing wages. Whether or not the voters would support that here, I don't know of that yet. I think one of the key things that we're struggling with is the contradictions. The legislature passed funding to try and encourage the location of more childcare services in affordable housing complex, which makes a lot of sense. And yet that's considered by BOLI to be a commercial use on the ground floor. And therefore we can't put childcare facilities in affordable housing because that would trigger paying the prevailing wage that developers just can't pencil out. It just doesn't economically work out to pay the prevailing wage to build a lot of regulated affordable housing. So we're hoping to work with labor in this next year to try and address that issue. So that's on my to-do list.
On your very long to-do list, right? I have a cluster of questions for Dominique. One of them was that you did go over a little bit, but could you please explain exactly how the Proud Ground Land Trust model works from the standpoint of the buyer?
Okay. So from the buyer's perspective, we are a HUD certified home counseling agency. So we talk with buyers about their financial situation and we prepare them in becoming mortgage qualified. And so let's say that we're looking at a home that's the market cost is $400,000, right? And so within that, there's a funding or a subsidy allocation, if you will, from a jurisdiction that's, let's call it $100,000. So now we brought the home price down from $300,000, the home price to the borrower or the buyer from $400,000 down to $300,000. And then we work with the buyer also to identify sources of down payment assistance. We might ask the buyer if they have an IDA account, which can be used for home purchases, if they want to use those funds to further reduce the mortgage that they would have on the home to, let's say, around $250,000, $275,000, I think is the max for an 80% AMI household right now, to round that number, $275,000. So if we can take a $400,000 market rate house and bring it down to an affordable level for an 80% home buyer, and you qualify for that mortgage at $275,000, just like you or I and others would qualify at a higher amount, we're actually creating a home ownership opportunity for that buyer that they otherwise would not have had. When you go on RMLS and look for a home that a person could buy for $275,000, they just don't exist out there. But there are many that exist as you start to reach over $400,000. And for the $400,000 homes, frankly, they are attached homes. So there are townhomes, different types of condominium structures, but they're a home that's their own as opposed to other types of living. And so our job is to work with the buyers to, one, identify properties that can receive the subsidy from a jurisdiction, but also to help them identify avenues for down payment assistance, how to best utilize their IDA to help them become mortgage ready. So their credit's good, their job history is good. These are many of our, and I always say this because it's true, these are many of our workers that are, they're core to our livability. So our teachers, we're worried about housing for teachers. School districts own more land than sometimes we could shake a finger at, and they hold on to it. And we wonder if there is a way for certain jurisdictions, school districts, cities in their surplus land to actually allow this to be more of a community benefit and to help us assist them in addressing issues around affordability for their workforce. And so these are some of the ways that we try to help from a buyer's perspective. But I think also when you think about some of the practical things that we hear on the news around, like, why are teachers striking? A lot of it is around livability and affordability. Well, if you're the school district and you have surplus land, and we are working with the school district in Southern Oregon to actually bring workforce housing at affordable levels to their workforce, because it's critical. It's critical not only for bringing folks into the community who might want to move from a different location and support and become part of that community, but it's also critical for folks who lived there for 20 years who never thought that they can buy because affordability has always been an issue. And so that's one example of how we support buyers, is bringing in the jurisdictional funds, but also connecting them to resources that help to bring the mortgage that they would qualify for to own that home down to a level that's affordable.
Can I step in for just a sec?
Sure.
Dominique, the cluster housing project that you were talking about in Milwaukee, is that on about 2.5 acres there, kind of beside the trolley trail, beside Highway 99? Is that the one you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a classic example of what you were just saying. So when the TriMet project was finishing up, I negotiated with, I was the mayor of Milwaukee at the time, and I negotiated with TriMet to pick up that property at a very, very low price, so that we could do exactly what you're talking about and be able to surplus that out for affordable housing. We had to do a little bit of work on the property to make it suitable for housing, but yeah, I'm glad that that's finally coming through, because that was a long time ago that I did that.
Yes, it has been some time, but the persistence and the insistence has paid off. And what cluster housing is, and I see this in the chat,
Uh-huh.
it's really individual housing units that are clustered together, so they would share common space. So think of it as townhome living where the walls have some separation between them. So call it 3 feet or 5 feet, but they're all on one tax lot as opposed to having individual tax lots. And that's what creates the cluster of the homes, is that they're really constructed within not individual tax lots for the homes.
And for another conversation, at least for the city of Portland and statewide, remember that single family residential tax lots have been kind of outlawed, that you have a right now to be able to divide up your property to create multiple living units. And so there's a great opportunity to start exploring creating more dense cluster housing within our dense, our existing neighborhoods. There hasn't been not a lot of people taking the opportunity yet, but at some point down the road, it's a path we need to go on. It's turning many of the single family homes into more dense cluster homes.
Sure. One of our stewardship projects right now is working with homeowners to add ADUs to their properties if they can handle that additional structure. There are banks out there who are financing these items at very low interest rates for again, income qualified homeowners. And so we're trying to connect our homeowners to resources that actually build additional wealth and an additional source of income for these families. So it's really a way for them to leverage even better the opportunity that they had initially gained through Proud Ground.
The kind of a different aspect of that, there is a question about, do you have affordable homes in multifamily buildings?
We do not. We have considered larger buildings that could be converted to condominiums and have ownership in there. What we've been focused on mostly originally was detached housing, because when you ask folks, that's what they want. The reality is that it doesn't pencil as much as it used to in the past to build the detached housing. And so we've been focused mostly on townhomes, but there are opportunities that we get presented with that where it's a repurposing of buildings downtown Portland, repurposing of apartments that could become condos. As we think about our primary clients, if you will, we look to family housing. And so I think from a priority perspective, some of the repurposing of the buildings downtown might not work as well for families, but it is something that we get presented with from time to time.
And if I can call attention, one of the key impediments for the home ownership model and multifamily housing is construction liability issues. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think there have been attempts to pass legislation to change kind of the liability laws, but I don't think it's passed yet. But there's one reason you're not seeing as many condominiums being built in the city of Portland anymore is just a lot of developers are really scared of there's a lot of exposure to, once buildings are built, issues with like the building envelope and water damage, etc. And then, homeowners associations suing the developer or the construction or architects, for being responsible for that damage. It's really kind of cooled off the interest in doing multifamily condominium development. That's for another conversation.
Yeah, I actually think there's a lot of room for a great conversation there. One of the things I did during the summer was to join a delegation to Singapore and Hong Kong to learn about the concept of social housing. And Singapore is really, really doing that well. They, I think the home ownership rates in Singapore, which is one of the most densest and most expensive places in the world, home ownership is at 80%. 80% of people own their own home. And the state has a great deal to do with that. And they are multifamily typically.
I have one last question for Mr. Merriweather. What is your financing, and do you need investors or donations to carry on your great work?
Oh, that's a great question. So from an operations standpoint, we are mostly funded through our lease fees from the homes. So we charge each homeowner a monthly lease fee. The lease fee has not changed in 25 years. So if you think about inflation or the price of eggs over that time, we still try to maintain affordability where all possible. As our portfolio grows, there's more opportunity for lease fee income. We also receive a great deal of donations to support our operations, but also to help us provide down payment assistance and close the gap for those homeowners. Oftentimes we find out that they're $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 short, and so we try to not lose an opportunity for them to own a home because they're because of that difference in appraisal or they couldn't pay off a credit card or something like that. But I would say the real funding that we get that's the most meaningful is the jurisdictional funding, whether it be from the state or from local jurisdictions. Those are the funds that allow us to bring the land into the land trust. And if you take the land out of the home buying equation, the structures can actually be affordable. It's the land that often makes them unaffordable. And so we look to effectively governmental sources for the most part to help us bring that part of our financing and our fundamental financial perspective. That's the way that our model works. I saw another question real quick. I just wanted to try to answer that. Yes, the property, the land is owned by the trust. The equity remains in the trust. Crown doesn't get the money at the resale. The equity stays inside the land trust. The ownership is of the building above ground. And we are working with many, mostly housing authorities and repurposing some of their plexes. We're working with Clackamas County Housing Authority right now, Vancouver Housing Authority, Washington County Housing Authority, and repurposing some of their plex buildings into home ownership opportunities. And we're providing the residents who've been there in those units the first opportunity to own that unit if they so choose.
Well, I wish we had more time. It's all fascinating information and great stuff. I wanted to put in a little plug for the League of Women Voters. We are, and Donna Cohen is the chair of our housing interest group, and she and a group of people are tracking the city's 5-year housing production strategy. And I wondered if anybody is interested in participating in that or attending the housing interest group meetings. Our next meeting is on March 18th, and the guest speaker will be Sharon Myron, so county commissioner. So the league is doing great things. All of you are doing wonderful things, and I appreciate all of the time you spent, your presentations, the answers, and everything. A couple other things are kind of interesting. This whole Johnson versus Grants Pass, another U.S. Supreme Court case about whether people who are homeless can remain on the street if there's no other accommodations. And last, Multnomah County and the city of Portland are proposing a plan to cut the homeless population in half, add hundreds of new shelter beds, and build more affordable housing and more, all by 2026. So stay tuned. There's lots of things going on, which all of you have pointed out to us. And I'm now going to turn it back to Carolyn to say, once again, thank you so much for all your information and all the hard work that you're doing.
Yes, thank you, Dom, Mark, Brian, and Ann. And also thank you to the audience for your thoughtful questions. We can't cover every topic in one panel, but I hope everybody learned at least something that they didn't know before. Thanks to Metro East Community Media for recording this program. The video and podcast will be available in a few days on our website, www.lwvpdx.org. Our next program is April 10th, and it's on Portland Public Schools, Opportunities and Challenges Ahead. It'll be at 7 o'clock on Zoom, and we're inviting top Portland Public School leaders to speak. So please mark your calendars for April 10th at 7 o'clock. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization, and we thank our members and who are volunteers and also donors and we welcome you to join our league. The program is also supported by donations to our education fund and by the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation. You'll find membership and donor information on our website, lwvpdx.org. Thanks to our panelists and listeners, and have a great evening, everyone.